Welcome to Global Connections on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today we'll talk about Japan. Is Japan still a leader of Greater Asia? How has Trump changed things? Our guest for the show is Carl Baker, Senior Advisor, Pacific Forum. Welcome to the show, Carl.
Good to be here, Jay. Always enjoyed talking about Japan and reminiscing about time I spent in Japan and what's happening with Japan now that it's sort of the senior statesman in Asia.
Yeah. Well, I like to think of Japan as our best friend in Asia. I'm not sure if you would agree, but I think to me, I've always seen it as a very friendly place, an easy place to get along in. And I think it's important that we have to preserve our relationship with Japan for better or worse, and follow its changing role because as everything now, its role is changing, and we have to notice the changes, we have to deal with the changes, and we have to continue to connect with them. So, Carl, I guess getting to the very top of it, and the changes not only in Japan but in all of Asia. What about Trump? Trump is tariff impositions. Trump has his attempts to dominate and his bullying and so forth. How has that changed Japan? How has it changed the American relationship with Japan?
Well, I think it's too early to tell the short answer for the impact of Trump. I mean, I think Japan certainly wants to try to get out up front with Trump and be, as you know, they talked about being the first one to negotiate a trade agreement with Trump. I think they feel like they have not been successful with that. The trade negotiators that went to Washington have gone back home frustrated with Trump's inability to articulate what United States wants from Japan. Japan certainly is interested in maintaining the relationship and is willing to be fairly accommodative of U.S. demands. I think that's the history of Japan. When you go back in the larger stretch of history, Japan, remember, was our enemy in the 1980s when we wrote books about the coming war with Japan because of its economic success. And so Japan is fairly familiar with a United States that sees Japan as an aggressive trading nation that took advantage of the United States in the 80s. And then, of course, we had the big economic collapse in Japan in the early 1990s, which people in Hawaii certainly experienced as suddenly Japanese money coming into the Hawaii dried up. And so Japan is fairly well versed in its relationship with the United States as a trader, as a trading partner. I think more so than other countries in Asia. And of course, Japan has become very dependent on the United States as a defense partner, especially in the aftermath of World War II. It basically took the Constitution given to it by the United States, swore to never again develop an offensive military capability. Article 9 of the Constitution left it with a self-defense force, which is still in existence today, and it's struggling with how does it redefine that defense force in today's world, where the United States now wants Japan to increase its defense budget and provide its defense beyond just its territorial waters. And so Japan is struggling, I think, with how to define itself, especially in the context of Trump. But it goes well beyond the Trump effect. It's really, how is Japan adjusting to its new role as, yes, an important defense partner, and yet it needs to maintain its trade relations with the rest of Asia.
Well, over recent years, its economy has been good. Its technology has been good. It's been a global leader in many ways in trade, for example. But there's so many factors that work against it. It's not just Trump. It's not just the trade war. It's the whole relationship with China. It's the bell curve. We ought to, take a look at all of these factors. And it has cultural issues that it really needs to resolve. So, I mean, looking at one thing at a time, it seems to me that you talked about dependency, military strategic dependency, but Japan is very dependent on the U.S., isn't it, economically, in terms of import export? And if we cut that off or shrink it down, Japan is going to be in trouble. And from a great economy a few years ago, it won't have a great economy anymore.
Well, its economy hasn't been all that great. I mean, it's they talk about the lost decade of the
Mm.
1990s, and that even extends well into the 2000s. So Japan has struggled with its economy, and don't forget its biggest trading partner is China, and it actually has a fairly significant trade deficit with China, while it has a trade surplus with the United States. So, and the numbers are fairly close. But the fact is that Japan actually largest trading partner is China today, and it by far almost double the size of its trade with the rest of the world and Asia. So it's big. Its big trading partner is really China and the rest of Asia. So, yeah, certainly Japan would suffer if it lost trading numbers with the United States, but it certainly can't give up its trading relationship with the rest of Asia.
Well, that's very important today because Xi Jinping is trying to establish new trading relationships and increase old trading relationships. And Japan has got to be on his list of dealing with the American trade war. So I guess what I hear you saying is that yes, Japan is dependent, economically dependent in terms of trade with the U.S., but it's not a be-all, end-all. And in fact, it would not be that damaging because there are other options that Japan would have,
Hmm.
courtesy China and other places. Don't you agree?
Yeah, I do. Well, I do agree, and I think there's been a big push by China and Japan and South Korea to reinvigorate the trilateral relationship between those three countries, and so they are now again talking about their own free trade agreement and to promote trade among the three countries. So certainly, Japan sees China as an alternative, and so does China see Japan as an alternative market as the exports to the United States dry up for China. So I think they both see each other as an important trade partner, and South Korea plays a part in that, and as does Southeast Asia. Japan is working very hard with Southeast Asia, specifically in trade, to improve that trade relationship. So, you know, uh, in the wake of Xi Jinping going to Southeast Asia to talk to Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, Prime Minister Ishba also went to Thailand and Vietnam and the Philippines to talk about trade with Japan. So clearly Japan is working very hard to develop its trade relations in Southeast Asia. I said he went to Thailand. He actually went to Vietnam. I misspoke.
I've been watching Jeffrey Sachs, economist out of Columbia. He's been very active on YouTube and in various international forums. And one of the things he says is that right now, just to your point, right now, regional trade arrangements are being made in the pause period, in the 90-day pause period around the world, where these groups, including groups that are encouraged by Xi Jinping and, for that matter, Vladimir Putin, are trying to set up systems that will compete with the U.S., that will displace the U.S., not only in terms of products and trade, but in terms of capital investment. And who knows where that goes in terms of reserve currencies. So right now, it sounds to me like Japan's best move as for a number of countries in that area, is to get into these regional trade agreements, and it's happening not only in Asia, but it's happening in Europe too.
Mhm. Yeah,
And Jeffrey Sachs goes into great detail about this.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, and that brings up the point that what Japan has done, and it's not just the Trump effect, but it certainly is being emphasized in the Trump era, is that they're trying to work on these regional agreements. And so Japan, well, as you know, was the leader in setting up the alternative after after the United States pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Japan was the leader in building the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership with the remaining members. And so Japan was certainly front and center in that effort, but it was also very much involved in finalizing the agreement with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which includes China and the rest of Southeast Asia and South Korea. So Japan certainly has been working that angle well before the Trump administration came in. And now it is certainly working those relationships and trying to build a stronger partnership with both Southeast Asia, but also Australia and South Korea.
Well, I think Japan brings a lot to the table. It's an advanced society and economy. It's advanced in terms of technology and quality of manufacturing. I mean, even now, there's still an argument as to whether Japan's manufactured goods are better, better tolerances, better quality than China's, although China would probably disagree with that. And it's got a kind of work ethic where people work for the same company most of their lives, where people are dedicated to Japan and to their companies and to their. It's an ordered society, and an ordered society is an economically effective, efficient society. So, in terms of its joinder into this new regional arrangement or improved regional arrangement, seems to me Japan brings a lot to the table, and it is an attractive partner. Am I right?
Mhm. Oh yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think that's how Japan sees itself and how the rest of the region sees Japan. You know, Japan is always viewed as very favorable in Southeast Asia. And you're right, it goes beyond just the trade agreements. They've also been very instrumental in something called the Chiang Mai Initiative, which was created in the late 90s with the Asian financial crisis, where Japan was one of the leading countries to set up this Chiang Mai initiative, which basically stabilizes currencies in the region. Because if you remember, the big concern then was the Thai currency. Baht was almost devalued to an extremely small amount in the late 1990s, and Japan stepped in, helped set up the Chiang Mai initiative with a huge inflow of capital to stabilize the currencies in Southeast Asia. And they're very, and to this day, Southeast Asia is very appreciative. And China has come on and tried to be a partner with Japan in stabilizing the financial markets in both uh, post 1990, the Asian financial crisis, and then again in the late 2000 or in the late 2008 aughts, 2008, 2009 with the global financial crisis. China again and Japan were there to stabilize the currencies and to offset the loss of the American market in that time.
With all of that, though, there are things happening in Japan which bespeak of trouble down the road. Uh, the assassination of Abe, for example, a couple of years ago, that was very troubling. You wouldn't expect that to happen in Japan. And just today, there was a fellow who decided his life wasn't worth living. So he drove his car into a bunch of school children, and he either killed or wounded seven or more of them.
Mhm. Yeah.
And when they asked him, what the problem was, he said, I just didn't feel good. And that's not much of a reason. But that kind of malaise maybe affecting Japan's way of doing things. And you wonder about, the unemployed group. There aren't many of them because Japan doesn't like people who are unemployed. They identified this guy as an unemployed worker,
Mhm.
and that's the worst thing you can be. But also, I think the fact is that the society is not what it was, and I mean it's close, but it's not what it was. And there's issues about homelessness and the ability to live the sweet life and live the sweet retirement. And at the same time, you have the bell curve, and the bell curve is really notoriously bad in Japan. And I saw one commentator, he said I forget what year it was, but down the road with the bell curve and the failure of Japanese young people to marry and have children and replace the generations that are dying will ultimately ruin the country. Who says when? But ultimately, this is a big problem. So if we look down the road and we say Japan has some important selling points right now, we also see these changes. And a question I put to you is, how serious are these changes? Is Japan doing anything to deal with them? Can Japan recover from these negative phenomena? And ultimately, are they important in Japan's future, or are they something that will change themselves?
Yes, I mean, demographics in Japan is a problem, that's for sure. And it's not just Japan. I mean, actually, South Korea in some ways is in worse shape than Japan with the younger generation not marrying, not having children, sort of rebelling against the old style of lifetime employment. So yeah, there's a lot of dissatisfaction in Japan. There's a fairly high suicide rate in Japan. This has been a problem for Japan for some time, but the demographic problem is certainly an overwhelming problem. It's one of the main features of Prime Minister Ishiba's effort to fix Japan, if you will, is address the demographic issues. And the demographics are everybody wants to live in the cities. The rural areas are depopulating. You hear stories of old people living in these towns, and they're the only ones there. Deserted houses that people are being offered for free if they'll just clean it up and pay the taxes. So yeah, demographics is a big issue. Japan has tried to address it, by with immigration, but immigration, of course, in Japan is a problem because there's language requirements that are still part of the system, and it's very difficult for people to immigrate into Japan. Uh, in some ways, they've tried to address it through immigration from Southeast Asia and to some extent South Asia. They haven't been completely successful, but they certainly recognize it that they are not going to be able to solve the demographic problem by getting young people to have more children. They realize that they have to come up with an immigration policy that is more accommodative of immigrants in Japan's society. And you see it, and, when you go to Japan and you get away from the tourist areas, that there are immigrants that are integrating themselves into Japan. It's not certainly not what you see in the United States, but there is an attempt to fix those demographic problems. And yeah, so they're working on it, but they certainly have a long way to go. And again, part of the problem is trying to populate these rural areas where the older generation are are there by themselves because the kids have moved either to the cities or out of the country.
On that point, Carl, I saw a very interesting video of exactly what you're talking about, a small town in a rural area. Maybe it was Hokkaido, I'm not sure. And the remarkable thing is these people felt they had no children around. So they made
Yeah.
children. They created models of children. The children sitting on park benches, children at the ball field, children, along the highway, and the whole town is filled with these models they build. The old people build models of young people,
Yeah.
which I find a very interesting and it's a uniquely Japanese kind of process. Don't you think?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, and honestly, Japan has been somewhat innovative in elder care because of that they've gone to robotics, they've gone to systems where you basically build robot assistants for the older people who are living living by themselves in these desolate, uh, forsaken towns that simply don't have the vibrancy of a new generation to take over.
I don't know why, but this reminds me of the whole issue about the trade war, and maybe the changing relationship, the changing national relationship between Japan and and the U.S. After all, it's been our best friend in Asia for so long. But now we have a trade war, and we used to have, I don't know the numbers, but we used to have virtually millions of Japanese coming over to Hawaii. Do you think that's changing? Will it change? Is there an edge on that now?
Yeah, I mean, the number, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head either, but certainly the numbers are down for Japanese tourists in Hawaii. Uh, but I don't know what the numbers are. But the other interesting thing that's happening is tourism in Japan, because the yen has depreciated. It's come back a little bit post Liberation Day on Trump's tariffs, but it was quite high, and so there is a big influx of tourism in Japan, taking notice of these strange events like you're talking about in the small towns, and experiencing Japan, you know, Mount Fuji, climbing Mount Fuji, and all those kinds of things that are attractive. And so tourism is a big thing in Japan. In fact, it's become so big that it's become uncomfortable for the Japanese with all the tourists. And so, uh, yeah, it is a factor that Japan has become attractive as a tourist destination. And yes, there are fewer Japanese traveling to Hawaii, uh, which does create problems for the Hawaii economy.
For sure. Well, you mentioned earlier about the new arrangements, the new trade arrangements between Japan and China and some of the other countries in Asia. And I wonder how that fits back at home. Remember, we have a Congress that's anti-China. We have a president who is at war with China and speaks of it. And then we have, Japan and other countries that are getting closer to China. Does that have an effect on the relationship of Japan and the U.S.? Are there people in the diplomatic circle in this country who hold that against Japan?
I don't think it's very visible yet. I mean, because it still is manifesting itself in how this trade relationship plays out, to the extent that Japan is going to is going to be seen as detrimental to the Americans' attempt to restructure trade, because certainly Japan is going to continue to pursue regional trade agreements and free trade. That, I think that's very much a fully committed position for Japan, that they see trade as their lifeblood, and they're not going to they're going to try to accommodate what the Americans want, I think, but it could very well become a point of contention. And I think this is what Japan is trying to avoid. And one of the ways they're trying to avoid that is to take on a bigger part of the defense relationship. So Japan is now committed to 2% of its GDP toward defense, and it's working very hard to satisfy American demands for a more equal defense partnership, which is somewhat ironic, given where, as I said when we started this conversation, that we were really encouraging Japan to not expand its defense capabilities. Where now, and this isn't new. Again, this has been around. I remember working with the military in Japan in the early 90s, where we were encouraging Japan to expand its defense capabilities. So that's not something new, but I think it's becoming more urgent for Japan to demonstrate its interest and willingness to expand its defense capabilities, specifically its maritime uh, capabilities. And it's working with its partners in Southeast Asia to expand maritime capacity, specifically law enforcement capacity. It's odd. I remember being in the Philippines talking to the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard had gotten new ships from Japan, but no armaments. They needed to get the armament for those ships from the United States. And so they were taking Japanese Coast Guard vessels, and then they were asking the United States to put guns on those vessels to actually make them useful for protecting Philippine maritime spaces. But Japan has been very active in building radars and building maritime domain awareness in Southeast Asia, and all the countries in Southeast Asia are very grateful for Japan's willingness to do that. But Japan does it not as a defense relationship, but really as a capacity building for domestic maritime security interests.
Yeah, sure. That's a big issue. But I remember reading somewhere that just as in Taiwan, the young people are not terribly interested in joining the military. I don't know if there's conscription or not in Japan, but I remember reading that the young generations, who should be getting married anyway, but aren't, the young generations not terribly interested in serving in the military. And at the end of the day, you have to have boots on the ground. I mean, if they have a purely technological rearmament, that doesn't necessarily do the job. What have you heard about this?
Yeah. Well, no, there is no conscription in Japan, and post World War II, again, this was very much a cultural thing in Japan that the military was not seen as an honorable career. There was no honor in being, not no honor. There was little emphasis put on the honor associated with serving as a military member for a young Japanese, and so it was almost discouraged. That it was, well, yeah, this child joined the military. Well, there must be something wrong with this child that he was in the military. What was he? Was he a social misfit or something? Why did he do that? That was almost the attitude that was there. Especially, I was there in the 80s and the 90s, and this was sort of the attitude, was that the military people weren't necessarily proud. So when they left their military base, they put on civilian clothes rather than walk out of the gate with their uniform.
Well, that happens in this country too, Carl.
Well, not so much in well, yeah, I mean that happened back in a particular time in this country, but this was the case of what happened in Japan, and so I think that's changing slowly. That there is a recognition that they do have to have some military capabilities, but they're still very much willing to finance the American presence in Japan, and we still have a huge presence. And one of the things we need to understand is that while typically the United States demands a lot of things from countries where they host U.S. forces, a lot of that comes from the example from Japan. That because in Japan, the Japan government provides a huge amount of money for the welfare of U.S. military families living in Japan. They build all the housing, they build all the recreation facilities, they basically build a lot of things, and they provide the finances to support local hires at those military bases. So all the Japanese workers at U.S. military installations are typically paid by the Japanese government. They're not paid by the U.S. government. So Japan has always shown a huge willingness to finance American military presence in Japan, partly because of the carryover from the 1950s, when that's what the United States wanted, to today, where the United States demands that they make the payments to those people to reduce costs for the Americans living.
Yeah, well, there are some huge bases still after all these years in Japan. Mile for mile, we probably have more bases in Japan than any other place in Asia. Huh? We have a couple of big naval bases, Air Force bases, and so forth, and they're not going away anytime soon, at least until Trump decides he wants to shut them down. Um, so I think that's an important connection point. But I wanted to ask you the title question here. is Japan still a leader of Greater Asia? Is it declining as a leader of Greater Asia? And from a diplomatic and economic point of view, what would you recommend to Japan to do to, because it pays to be a leader, it pays to do trade. These are fundamental points. What would you recommend Japan do to maintain its leadership, to improve its leadership in Greater Asia?
I mean, Japan is a leader. I mean, China has become the leader in Asia. I think it's become the economic leader. I think Japan, when you say Japan as the leader, Japan has been the leader of democratic Asia. It has been the leading force in promoting economic development in Southeast Asia and promoting democracy in Asia. So it's been a strong partner for the Philippines, for Thailand, but it also has always been willing to look the other way. So in Myanmar, or Burma, Japan has had a huge presence, even during the former uh, junta, that the military government that ran um, Myanmar for 40 years prior to its democratization in 1914 or in 2014. Japan had always maintained its presence there. Japan has always maintained its presence in Cambodia and has funded elections in Cambodia and has built a lot of infrastructure in those areas. When you go to Vietnam, you see a lot of infrastructure built by Japan. It's promoted democracy, but it hasn't tried to impose democracy. It's always been willing to maintain a relationship, even when the countries in the region have moved away from democracy. Japan has always maintained its strong economic development presence, and so in that sense, it's the leader. But China has, in some ways, displaced them as the economic leaders just by virtue of the mere size of China's economy versus Japan's economy, and the huge impact that China has had in recent years with its infrastructure development that has become a competitor for Japan. So Japan and China now really compete for that economic development uh, role as the leader in Asia. So I think it's, yes, Japan is still a leader, but I think in Southeast Asia specifically, and to some extent South Asia, they 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 see Japan and China as competing in a positive way, not necessarily in a negative, deleterious way, but they see Japan and China as equals in that leadership position, and that's fine with Southeast Asia. They like it that way. What they don't like is the United States' approach of you have to choose between us or China. Japan has
Mm.
never taken that role. They've always said we'll lead in our own way and to the extent we can. And we recognize that you have an alternative in China, but we're going to show you why our alternative is better. And so I would say to Japan, that is exactly what they need to keep doing. They can't give up on that approach. And they can't give up on the approach of promoting strong maritime capacity building and capacity building that gives these countries in Southeast Asia agency in their own defense and in their own economic development. And I think that's what Japan has done, and that's what they need to keep doing. They can't lose sight of the importance of that, even in the face of a United States that is probably becoming less reliable as a defense partner. And so Japan, my advice to Japan is, yes, continue to build your defense capability and your own capacity to defend your territorial spaces, but you need to maintain that leadership role, even in the face of a stronger, more visible China.
It always amazes me that China is involved in a very robust trade with Taiwan, and they managed to do it and get along. And it's like the economics are overtake the political considerations. That doesn't mean they won't attack Taiwan one day, but at least for now they're going to trade. And I also see the trade between Japan and China. as along a similar line in the sense that they're competitors. Sometimes I'm sure they're in contention over certain issues, trade issues, political issues, geopolitical issues. But it's in Japan's best interest to trade, and it's obviously in China's best interest to trade with Japan. But there must be some contention there. After all, as you mentioned, Japan is trying to rearm. It's trying to spend more money on military, power, and that is all directed at China. It's not directed at any other country. So, what's the status of tension, if you will, between the two countries, Japan and China?
Yeah, it's there, and it's there specifically in the East China Sea over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. That's still a big area of contention. Japan is fairly accommodative, I think, of the Chinese going through the Miyako Straits out into the Pacific. Those are international waters. There's no reason why they shouldn't allow that and accommodate that. But they're also very careful. They're very defensive of what China is trying to do in making territorial claims in the Senkakus. And so there's tension there, but it's tension that I think is well managed and understood by both sides, that there's limits, and those limits have to do with occupying those islands in the Senkaku Diaoyu area. And I think that they're really it's really been done well by both sides, that they both recognize that there has to be deference to the other's interests in those areas. But certainly Japan has been very strong. It sees, and not just China. Japan's real concerns are North Korea with its capability to shoot a missile at Japan these days, and also Russia. It still has concerns with what Russia is up to in the northern part of Japan. There still is the territorial dispute between Japan and Russia over the Kurils.
Yeah, they were, and the Russian planes are overflying Japan a couple of months ago. I remember reading that, which is really
Yeah.
out of their territory, but there you go. And so, yeah, just as a footnote to what you were saying, it seems to me that right now, in the pause, if you will, China is trying to be more amenable to everyone. China is trying to play a different role,
Mhm.
doesn't want to be considered a bully or a debt trap investor. It wants to be a more of a global leader. And I think it is achieving that. One of the things that I've noticed on YouTube is that China is pumping out these video programs of all of its boundaries, Nepal, Tibet, Bhutan,
Mhm.
to demonstrate, that it's a beautiful place. The people have a great culture. They don't focus too much on surveillance or anything with Tianjin. It's a Tianjin, Xinjiang, with the Uyghurs. They don't
Oh,
focus on
oh, oh, yeah,
tension with the Uyghurs.
Xinjiang.
Xinjiang.
Yeah.
And they really tried to give you a very positive view of China in that area and maybe around in other cities. And some of the other cities in China are really beautiful. Whether their economy is going the way they want or not, these cities are spectacular. The airports, train stations, high-speed trains by which you can get from Beijing to Hong Kong in 7 hours, which is 2,500 kilometers. That's a long way.
Mm.
And so what we have is this promotional effort by China to demonstrate that they're, at the top of their game.
Mm.
And I suspect that's real. I don't think that's just phony. I think they are taking advantage of what Trump has created in
Oh,
terms of this gap, this war, and they're trying to come out on top. How does that affect Japan?
I mean, I think if it affects Japan, that Japan recognizes it has to maintain its relationship with both China and the United States. And this has been Japan since the 1800s, really. When you look at what Japan is in the broader brush of history. they recognize that they need to find that balance between West and East. And they've always been almost schizophrenic in it, that they're willing to accommodate the West to the extent they can, and they're almost willing to be the interloper for the West in the rest of Asia. But they also recognize that they're in Asia and they need to be a part of Asia. And so this is what makes it so difficult for Japan. Is they're determined to maintain that relationship with China that isn't overly aggressive. They've learned their lesson from the imperial era. They've learned the lesson of the greater uh, East Asia co-prosperity sphere. They want to maintain the elements of that without the belligerence that we saw with Imperial Japan. And I think that this is today's Japan, is they want to redo that co-prosperity sphere with minus the imperial belligerence.
Yeah, we talked earlier about regional trade arrangements which have sprung out of Trump's tariff war. But one of the things that's come to my attention anyway is with regard to Canada. Canada used to have a kind of a way of looking at North and South. Trade was North to South, South to North. Now Canada sees it differently. Canada sees it on a East to West basis. Canada looks to Asia. Canada wants to make deals with China. It's got to get rid of its oil and gas. It's got to sell its products, including agricultural products. So China's a perfect recipient for that. But what about Japan? Is Japan on the same east to west continuum for Canada, do you think? Is it going to benefit by this east to west paradigm?
For Japan, Canada certainly it represents a another alternative for natural resources. But I think Japan really sees itself as again, it sees itself as Asia, and so it's not really east to west for them as much as it is north to south, but it's north to south in Asia. And so I think that it still sees itself as an important partner, uh, and Europe and Japan also have some connection. So but I don't think that they see east to west as much as Canada does. Also, the other big partner for Japan is Australia. They import Japan exports a lot imports a lot of agricultural goods from Japan or from Australia. And so there's a strong connection between Japan and Australia, both for defense as well as for trade. And so I think that it sees itself as being more connected in that way rather than in the east west that you have in Canada. One other thing I want to say is that again, I don't see this as a byproduct of Trump. I see this as, for Japan anyway, a much longer duration. That this has been going on really since the United States has started walking away from free trade in Asia. And I mark that back to really to the Clinton era, if you will, if you want to start someplace. Maybe you could probably take it back into Nixon with the end of the Vietnam War. But certainly since the Clinton era, that we've been reluctant to engage in free trade. And so, this is I think is something that Japan has seen coming. They're not being blindsided here. They've recognized that they need to maintain the relationship between the United States as a security benefactor and Asia as a trade benefactor.
One last point, and it springs off one of the things you said, is that Japan, I don't know if it was doing this before, has renewed or increased interest in Europe because Europe needs to find a market also. Europe needs to connect up on new global arrangements. And yes, Japan would be most benefited by regional trade arrangements, but it would also be benefited by arrangements with Europe. And I take the point that Japan, as so many other countries now, are thinking about trade in a global context. And is there any reason why Japan would not make a deal with the EU or member countries of the EU to export some of its manufactured goods and to import some of their goods and so forth, but to reorganize the whole global trade affair? Your
Yeah.
thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly what Japan sees. And and actually there's been a strong connection between Europe or between the UK and Japan for the defense relationship. Now, maybe it's because they're both islands, but the fact is that they've been strong partners with the UK in the defense relationship. But yeah, also I think what you're seeing and going back to your point about China taking advantage of this. Yeah, it's starting to portray itself as the protector of free trade, as the promoter of free trade, and I think Japan doesn't really mind that. I think that it sees that as the larger beneficial framework that they can operate in. They don't mind if China wants to take that role. I don't think China is prepared to take over world domination and world leadership on it yet. China is kind of willing to be a partner here with these other regions, and ultimately what it does is it isolates the United States. And of course, this is what Trump is accelerating is Trump is the United States' isolation. It's not sui generis with Trump that this is happening. This is something that's been going on for some time. Trump is simply accelerating that process where the United States isolates itself from this global trade pattern that both China and Japan are prepared to take advantage.
Yeah, it doesn't help the United States at all. I mean, the basic principle is the more trade you do, the better you do. The less trade you do, the worse you do. Anyway, Carl, this is such an interesting topic and discussion. Thank you so much for all these points to help us understand what's going on and what will go on with regard to Japan and the rest of the world, the rest of Asia and the rest of the world. Thank you so much to our guest, Carl Baker, Senior Advisor, Pacific Forum. I'm Jay Fidell, happy to have these discussions. I'm host of Global Connections, and today we've been discussing Japan. Is Japan still a leader of Greater Asia? It's a complex answer, but I think we have our hands around it. Thank you, Carl. Thank you to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next show. Aloha.